Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a story that is absolutely critical for understanding global energy markets and geopolitics right now. On January 14th, 2026, Russia's state-owned oil company Rosneft made a very bold and very public statement about its assets in Venezuela. And let me tell you, the timing of this statement is everything. So what happened? Rosneft came out and said, quote, "All assets of Rosneft JSC in Venezuela are owned by the Russian state." Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's obvious. It's a state-owned company. But here's why this matters. This statement came just days after a major U.S. military operation in Venezuela on January 3rd that resulted in the capture of former President Nicolas Maduro. President Trump has been talking openly about U.S. control over Venezuela and encouraging American oil companies to invest heavily in the country's oil sector. Let me break down what's actually going on here. Rosneft isn't just some random Russian company. It's owned by a unit of the Russian Ministry of Economic Development, which means it's directly controlled by the Russian government. And it's not a small player in Venezuela either. This company holds stakes in 5 separate joint ventures with PDVSA, which is Venezuela's massive state-owned oil company. Now, here's a crucial piece of history you need to understand. Rosneft actually took over these Venezuelan holdings in 2020 from another Russian oil giant called Rosneft. Why did Rosneft exit? U.S. sanctions. The United States put so much pressure on Rosneft through sanctions that they were forced to pull out of Venezuela entirely. So Rosneft stepped in and acquired all these assets at what they claim was full market value, and they got approval from Venezuelan regulators. Think about the significance of that for a moment. Russia essentially created a workaround for U.S. sanctions. When one Russian company got too much heat, another one quietly stepped in to maintain Russia's strategic foothold in Venezuela's oil sector. This isn't just about business. This is about geopolitical influence and energy security for Russia. Now let's talk about why Russia cares so deeply about Venezuela in the first place. Venezuela has some of the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world. We're talking about massive reserves. The problem is that Venezuela's oil infrastructure has been deteriorating for years due to mismanagement, lack of investment, and international sanctions. The potential is enormous, but the actual production has been declining. For Russia, Venezuela represents several things. First, it's a strategic partnership in a region where the United States has traditionally dominated. Russia and Venezuela have built deep ties that go beyond just energy. We're talking about defense cooperation, diplomatic alignment, and economic integration. Energy is just one pillar, but it's a crucial one because oil and gas are fundamental to Russia's economy and global influence. Second, Venezuela gives Russia a presence in Latin America and specifically in oil markets that matter. When Russia has a stake in Venezuelan oil production and infrastructure, it has leverage in global energy discussions. It's about influence and having a seat at the table in multiple regions around the world. Third, these joint ventures with PDVSA generate revenue for Russia and help sustain economic ties with an important ally. Even if Venezuela's production is lower than it could be, these partnerships still matter financially and strategically. So, when Rosneft comes out with this statement emphasizing that these assets belong to the Russian state and were acquired legally at full market value with proper regulatory approval, they're essentially drawing a red line. They're saying, these are ours. We followed the rules. Don't even think about touching them. But why make this statement now? That's where things get really interesting. After the U.S. military operation on January 3rd that led to Maduro's capture, President Trump started talking about how the U.S. could run Venezuela and how American oil companies should invest there. This creates massive uncertainty for any foreign company with assets in Venezuela, but especially for Russian companies. Think about it from Russia's perspective. They've invested in these Venezuelan assets. They've maintained their presence there despite U.S. sanctions, political instability, and economic challenges. And now suddenly there's a U.S. military operation, a captured Venezuelan president, and the American president is talking about U.S. control and American investment in Venezuela's oil sector. Russia is watching this and thinking, wait a minute, are our assets at risk here? The statement from Rosarubizhneft is essentially a preemptive move to establish their claim and make it clear that they consider these assets untouchable Russian state property. What's also fascinating is Russia's broader response. The Russian Foreign Ministry has called for Maduro's release and is advocating for dialogue between the U.S. and Venezuela. Notice they're not being overly aggressive, but they're definitely making their position known. President Putin himself has stayed quiet publicly about the operation, which is also interesting. That silence could be strategic, letting the Foreign Ministry handle the diplomatic response while companies like Rosarubizhneft make their own statements about assets. The relationship between Russia and Venezuela goes way back and has only deepened in recent years. During Maduro's presidency, Russia provided crucial support to Venezuela, including financial backing, diplomatic cover at the United Nations, and military cooperation. Venezuela, in turn, has been a reliable ally for Russia in international forums and has aligned with Russian positions on major global issues. This partnership has always been about more than just oil. It's been about creating a multipolar world where U.S. influence isn't absolute. Venezuela represents one of the few strong allies Russia has in the Western Hemisphere, and Russia has invested heavily in maintaining that relationship. So now we have this incredibly complex situation where U.S. military action has created a new reality in Venezuela, and Russia is scrambling to protect its interests and assets, while also supporting its ally diplomatically. The statement from Rosarubizhneft is just the opening move in what could be a much longer chess game over Venezuela's future and who controls its vast oil resources. Now let's talk about what all of this means for global energy markets, for you and me as consumers, and for the broader geopolitical landscape. Because I promise you, what happens with these Russian oil assets in Venezuela doesn't just stay in Venezuela. The ripple effects could be significant. First, let's address the elephant in the room, oil prices. The article mentions that global oil prices have been relatively depressed in recent years because of ample supply and slowing demand growth. That's been good news for consumers. When you go to fill up your car or when businesses calculate their energy costs, lower oil prices mean lower costs across the board. But here's where things get concerning. Analysts are warning that geopolitical risks are rising significantly, and Venezuela is right at the center of these concerns. The article specifically mentions that some analysts are warning about the increased risk of an oil price shock. Let me explain what that means and why it matters to you. An oil price shock is when oil prices suddenly surge dramatically in a short period of time. This isn't just a gradual increase. We're talking about a rapid spike that can send shock waves through global markets and the entire world economy. Why? Because oil is fundamental to almost everything. It's not just about gasoline for your car. Oil is used in transportation, manufacturing, plastics, chemicals, agriculture, and countless other industries. When oil prices spike suddenly, everything gets more expensive. Transportation costs rise, which means the cost of shipping goods increases, which means the prices you pay at stores go up. Manufacturing becomes more expensive. Even food prices rise because modern agriculture relies heavily on fuel for machinery and transportation. An oil price shock can trigger inflation, slow economic growth, and create financial market volatility. So why are analysts worried about this now? Venezuela is back in focus because of the U.S. military operation and the uncertainty around what happens next. Here's the thing. Even though Venezuela's oil production has declined significantly from its peak, It still matters in global oil markets. Venezuela has the potential to be a major oil producer, and any major changes in its production levels or who controls its oil sector can affect global supply calculations. But Venezuela isn't the only concern. The article mentions renewed tensions involving Iran, which is another major oil producer. When you have multiple geopolitical hotspots involving oil-producing nations all heating up at the same time, that's when markets get really nervous. Traders start pricing in risk premiums, and that can drive prices up even before any actual supply disruptions occur. Now let's think about what could happen with Russia's Venezuelan assets specifically. There are several possible scenarios, and each one has different implications. Scenario 1. The status quo holds. Russia maintains its assets in Venezuela, and despite the political changes, the joint ventures with PDVSA continue operating. In this scenario, Russia keeps its foothold in Venezuela's oil sector and production continues at current levels or potentially increases if there's new investment and political stability. This would be the least disruptive outcome for global oil markets. Scenario 2. Russia's assets are challenged or seized. If the new political reality in Venezuela leads to efforts to remove or marginalize Russian interests, that could create a major conflict. Russia has made very clear through Rosneft a statement that it considers these assets to be sovereign Russian property. If there is any move to take these assets away, Russia could respond in various ways, from legal challenges to diplomatic pressure, to economic retaliation elsewhere in the world. Scenario 3. Increased American involvement changes the game. If U.S. companies start investing heavily in Venezuela, as President Trump has suggested, and if this leads to increased production and modernization of Venezuela's oil infrastructure, that could actually increase global oil supply over time. More supply generally means lower prices, which would be good for consumers, but would also put pressure on other oil producers, including Russia. The wild card in all of this is how Russia responds to these changing dynamics. Russia's economy is heavily dependent on energy exports. Oil and gas revenues are crucial for funding the Russian government and maintaining economic stability. Any threat to Russian energy interests tends to get a strong response from Moscow. We also need to consider the broader context of U.S.-Russia relations. Relations between Washington and Moscow are complicated, to put it mildly. Venezuela represents one of many points of tension between these two powers. How this situation plays out could set precedents for other disputes over resources and spheres of influence around the world. For investors and for people watching global markets, this situation creates uncertainty. Markets hate uncertainty. Even if nothing dramatic happens, the mere possibility of conflict over Venezuelan oil assets, potential supply disruptions, or escalating tensions can create volatility in energy markets and in financial markets more broadly. What I am watching for personally is how Russia and the U.S. navigate this situation in the coming weeks and months. Will there be direct negotiations about the future of foreign assets in Venezuela? Will Russia double down on its claims and create a confrontation? Will the U.S. push hard to marginalize Russian influence in Venezuela? Or will there be some kind of accommodation? I'm also watching global oil production levels and prices closely. If we start seeing oil prices creeping up significantly, that could be an early warning sign that markets are pricing in increased geopolitical risk. The analysts mentioned in the article are concerned about oil price shocks, and that's something we all need to take seriously. For you as viewers, the practical impact comes down to this. The situation in Venezuela matters for energy prices, which affect everything from your transportation costs to the prices you pay for goods and services. It matters for geopolitical stability, and it matters as an example of how complex global politics have become, where an operation in one country immediately creates tensions involving multiple major powers with competing interests. This is a developing story, and I'll be following it closely. If you want to stay updated on how this situation evolves and what it means for global markets and geopolitics, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think is going to happen with Russia's Venezuelan assets. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.